Good afternoon. My name is Philip Brenner. I'm Professor Emeritus at American University. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, which is sponsored by ASERI, the Alliance for Cuban Engagement and Respect. ASERI is a coalition of more than 40 U.S. organizations promoting the view that conflicts or ideological differences between countries should be resolved by engagement and mutual respect, not by the use of coercive means such as sanctions or economic blockades. Its mission is to inform policymakers about the promotion by grassroots groups of policies that will result in mutually beneficial and respectful relations between Cuba and the United States. We also want to thank Just Foreign Policy for its support. JFP is a nonpartisan membership organization advocating for a U.S. foreign policy based on diplomacy, law, and cooperation. Our objective today is to provide you with information from Cuban and Cuban American experts about current conditions in Cuba and ways in which a changed U.S. policy could help to ameliorate suffering that Cubans are enduring. The unprecedented July 11th demonstrations came at a moment that could be called a perfect storm. COVID-19 was at a high point. Cuba's two main sources of hard currency, remittances and tourism, had dried up, in part because of U.S. sanctions. The loss of hard currency made it difficult for Cuba to purchase food and medical supplies, and the government's decision to end the dual currency system generated a heavy inflation. Conditions are better today, but Cubans still are suffering. We want to highlight for you a Dear Colleague letter from Representatives Jim McGovern, Barbara Lee, and Gregory Meeks, which asks President Biden to address humanitarian needs in and restore engagement with Cuba. A little more about that at the end. Of course, we want to leave time for you to ask questions to our panel of experts. Let me tell you who they are. Ricardo Torres is a fellow at American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, and he's the chief editor of a series called Views on the Cuban Economy. Dr. Torres was a professor for 15 years at the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the University of Havana. Ricardo Herrero is executive director of the Cuba Study Group, which focuses on educating policymakers on policies that improve the well-being of the Cuban people at home and in the diaspora. Rick is a strategic communications and public affairs professional with close to 2 decades of experience working at the intersection of international relations, politics, media, and philanthropy. He served as the executive director of the Miami-Dade Democratic Party in 2010. Harold Cardenas Lima is director of the independent online magazine La Joven Cuba. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University and had been a professor of philosophy for more than 5 years at the University of Matanzas in Cuba. Harold also served as an intern at the Council on Foreign Relations and as a research assistant at Columbia University. Carlos Alzugurai has a very long biography, and I'll only give it to you briefly. He is a former vice rector of Cuba's Institute for the Advanced Study of International Relations. He's also been a visiting professor at Harvard University, Johns Hopkins University, the City University of New York, and Beloit College. At present, he serves as the chairman of the nonfiction literature section of the Cuban Union of Writers and Artists. They will each speak for 7 minutes, and I'll be a dictatorial timekeeper. But first, we want to offer you a 4-minute video about the July 11th protests. This is an excerpt from a longer video that's available on YouTube. Please watch the video now.
We have to vote for a new Cuba policy as well. This administration approach isn't working.
Here in Cuba, we expected a change in U.S. policy when Biden was elected, and we weren't the only ones.
Our expectations were that he would quickly do away with many of the policies that seemed extremely politically driven. Often a crisis gives you a chance to change policy. And Cuba has been experiencing a deep economic crisis driven primarily by COVID, the loss of tourism, and the Trump measures. It would have been so easy on humanitarian grounds to argue, this is a crisis, let's help the Cuban people. And this administration completely missed the opportunity. So there were some things that would have been very easy: to restore remittances, one memorandum; to reverse the Trump policy of putting Cuba on the terrorist list, one memorandum; to reopen the embassy, but they didn't do it. And they've escalated what they call democracy promotion programs, which are really regime change programs to put pressure on the government. The Biden administration, they are now stuck in a trap. The 11 July protests in Cuba, which have been spun almost universally here in the United States as evidence of increasing prospects of regime collapse in Havana, have further strengthened those who've argued that now is not the time to do a new policy.
This year, the economic situation got so bad, you could feel the anger and tension in the street.
Cuba was a tinderbox. It would only take a spark to start a fire.
The July 11 protests didn't start in Havana. They began here in downtown San Antonio de los Baños, a small city not far from Cuba's capital. San Antonio has been calm since July 11. So why did people take the streets here?
El 11 de julio, ¿cuál es el motivo de la protesta?
Habían varios motivos. El tema de la corriente fue uno. Quizás en algún punto era el pico de la pandemia también. Se juntaron varias situaciones.
Hola.
Los apagones eran 4 horas, 5 horas. Por eso fue la revuelta que hubo aquí en San Antonio de los Baños. La situación aquí en Cuba ha sido mala. La medicina entra pocas veces a la farmacia. La dipirona no ha entrado. Hace como 3 meses que no entra.
El apagón fue el top, ya el pueblo estaba tan a tope entre COVID y medicinas que no tenía. El pueblo, mientras no le afecte mucho el tema medicina y más o menos tenga su plato de comida, no va a protestar. 20 pesos, un peso, plátano, burro, ¿qué más quiere que te diga?
¿Qué es lo más difícil?
Las medicinas y el alimento, las dos cosas más importantes.
¿Por qué usted cree que la gente se lanza a la calle?
Aquí en las divisas, yo por lo menos no puedo acceder ahí. Yo no gano mal en mi trabajo porque trabajo en el campo, pero no puedo comprar nada. El bloqueo es que nos tiene a nosotros contra la pared.
The Cuban government blames the economic crisis on US sanctions, and many Cubans agree.
Hola, buenos días.
El bloqueo afecta al pueblo completo. Lo que Trump hizo a Cuba, 100 y pico medidas para jodernos a nosotros. Y ahora es baile, tan sinvergüenza como el otro.
We've lived under the US blockade for as long as I've been alive, and a lot longer than that. We have struggled and have found ways to survive, but this past year, they pushed us to the brink.
Para luego pretender que nos estaban ayudando.
Well, welcome back. We now turn to our panelists, and we look forward to having your questions and answers afterwards. Let me ask the first question to Ricardo Torres. Ricardo, what is the current economic situation in Cuba, and how is US-Cuba policy impacting on it? And to what extent do you think that the weak performance of the Cuban economy is a result of the US embargo and even the new sanctions?
Thank you, Phil. And thanks also for the invitation to participate. Definitely the economic situation right now is very challenging in Cuba. We saw the Cubans themselves, speaking about that in very plain language. And GDP has contracted in the last 3 years more than 13%. That is a big chunk of economic activity. If you think of import exports, foreign trade, that is very important for the developing country, small country like Cuba. So only imports have contracted more than 30%, 30%. That is a lot. That is a lot of, lots of stuff, consumption goods and all that energy that has not, made it to Cuba in the last 2 years. And frankly speaking, part of that is definitely the U.S. embargo in general, Trump sanctions, the reduction in remittances, COVID-19. We also know that, part of that is the fact that, reforms have been very timid in the last 10 years, economic reforms in Cuba. They have not been very successful. So, of course, there is a narrative that tries to establish that, most of Cuba's problems, or even all of them, are, due to the U.S. sanctions. We know that that is not true, but the U.S. embargo does affect the Cuban economy. I mean, of course, and it has to be like that. I mean, if you think of sanctions as a tool that some governments use around the globe, is very rational. The fact that they are able to, in a way, punish the other government or the other country for a behavior that is considered to be out of the norm. And in the case of Cuba, one also has to consider the fact that it is a very comprehensive set of sanctions that include financial aspects as well as technological ones. There are many studies that show consistently that Cuba's trade patterns are distorted due to the U.S. embargo. For instance, by increasing trade costs, because we have to trade with more distant partners, or by, for instance, augmenting the need to have permanent storage of warehousing capacities because of so-called extended supply chains. If you look at a map, it's very easy to understand why the U.S. embargo has a key impact on Cuba. Cuba is very close to the United States, and the U.S. will be Cuba's natural partner in any circumstance. So the embargo is real. It's real. There is a 449 pages report by the United States International Trade Commission that describes some of the effects of the U.S. restrictions. You can go there, you can see them by yourself. That was something that was done, written by Americans themselves. It's a very professional assessment of the impact of the U.S. embargo. You can also think of remittances. There are more than 2 million Cubans living in the United States. Some of them send money, so it has become a key source of foreign exchange for Cuba. So the embargo is real. That's the key message here. Then we have to distinguish between the Cuban people and the Cuban government. And we know that the burden of the embargo has fallen on the shoulders of the Cuban people, the very same people that you saw in that small video before the presentation started. So it is true that for a long time, the Cuban authorities have blamed the U.S. for everything that goes wrong in Cuba. Including problems and inefficiencies created by our economic model. But at the same time, and that in a way, it is a big problem, because in a way it's a convenient excuse and a powerful distraction from the real issues that we know affect Cuba's economy. And we know that because those problems existed in other countries, in other societies that used, or that in a way went through a period in their history when they use a model similar to the one that exists in Cuba. So in that sense, the U.S. embargo is also counterproductive. It gives a perfect arguments to deviate attention from some of the real problems. On top of that, we also know that the embargo affects disproportionately certain segments of the Cuban population. The disenfranchised, those who are not connected to the dynamic sectors, or those who do not work for foreign companies or don't have relatives abroad that can send money on a regular basis. So in that sense, the U.S. embargo is also unfair, because it punishes especially the most vulnerable part of the Cuban population. And it's also now the fact that it is affecting the emerging private sector, the new Cuban entrepreneurs, a sector that is one of the few, we can say few fresh developments in Cuba in the last decade or so. I'm including here the cooperatives as well. And the private sector should be one of the national counterparts for a conversation with Cuba, but with Cuba at large, not with the segments or parts of Cuba that we want to see or that we feel more comfortable talking to. So in that sense,
2 minutes, Ricardo.
the embargo is also contradictory. Because on the one hand, we maintain that we want to see meaningful change in Cuba, that we want to empower independent actors within Cuba. At the same time, these sanctions are hurting and are causing problems for the Cuban entrepreneurs when they deal with foreign companies to make payments, to source materials, and so on. They have to deal with all the big set of financial sanctions that are imposed on Cuba. So it's for a Cuban, it's in a way a very important and visible and clear contradiction. So it is used to say that we are defending the rights of the Cuban people by, in a way, violating those same rights, and it's simply not. It's not good, and it also, if we look at the last 60 years, it's failed to accomplish anything meaningful, rather than putting even more an even bigger burden on the shoulders of the Cuban people. So my time is over. So I look forward to questions at the end of the presentations of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Let me remind the audience that in order to ask a question, you need to put the question in the Q&A box. You aren't able to speak, and so raising your hand won't help. And we look forward to answering questions, so please do. There are more than 70 participants already in this webinar, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions. We turn now to Rick Guerrero. Rick, in February 2021, your organization, the Cuba Study Group, published a comprehensive policy vision for US-Cuban relations in the Biden era. So to what extent are these policy suggestions still a possibility for the Biden administration?
Thank you, Phil, and thank you everyone for joining us. Apologies that I am speaking from a phone, and I also will not be able to stick around for the Q&A as I had a prior engagement before joining this meeting. But to answer your question, we do think that there is still time to turn things around. It is our belief that if left to the preferences of the individuals in this administration, we would have already seen a pivot towards a more common sense Cuba policy, one focused on empowering the people while holding the government accountable for its many abuses and failures, one that recognizes that blanket sanctions on things like travel and remittances have a disproportionate impact on Cubans on the ground, on families, on entrepreneurs, and don't really harm the rulers whose behavior we're trying to change through these policies. We think this would have happened already, but the dynamics in the Senate have made it very difficult. The 50-50 split and sort of the outsized influence that senators such as Bob Menendez has in that split has made it so that for the time being, and until I think we see some of these bills get through, as we saw with the infrastructure bill earlier this week, and now the soft infrastructure, the social bill that's coming up. Once we see these bills get through, we think it does open up an opportunity for this administration to really start acting on not only its campaign promises of reopening travel and remittances, but also taking other measures to help support the Cuban people. At the same time, recognizing that the scenario has changed dramatically since the Obama years in Cuba and in relations between the United States in Cuba. One thing that we learned during the Obama years is that you can try to lift sanctions unilaterally and think that the Cuban government will just play ball. But if the Cuban government doesn't do its part to really generate the political momentum necessary in the United States to go all the way to lift the embargo, it simply won't happen, right? We saw during the Obama years efforts to try to lift all sanctions. Obama went very far doing that through executive authority. But even during the best of times, or at least the times when there was the most momentum to go all the way, you still couldn't get it through Congress. And it's because there's a very active opposition in Congress that insists that we must take into account the Cuban government's human rights abuses. Many of them also just believe in regime change policy. And you're not going to overcome that if we don't see changes in behavior in Cuba. Let's keep in mind the reason why so much of the embargo is codified into law is because it was codified into law under Helms-Burton. Helms-Burton was a bill that at its time was considered too extreme to pass Congress. It was sitting in a shelf and was not collecting sponsors. Then the Cuban government shot down 2 civilian planes over international waters. And on an election year, on a presidential election year, that created the momentum to sign Helms-Burton into law. You're going to need another momentous action or series of actions to gin up that kind of political momentum to really create the political capital necessary for those who prefer to see a policy of engagement, a policy that eliminates these blanket sanctions towards Cuba, really see that change in Congress. Biden has mentioned several times, or at least his administration has, saying that they want to have a sustainable policy towards Cuba, and and by that they mean a politically sustainable policy, one that could withstand the political swings in the U.S. electorate and the changes of administration from Republican to Democrat to back to Republican. Sustainable policy is really the animating idea behind our policy recommendations to the Biden administration, and it recognizes, and as I mentioned before, that to do that, you need to build political momentum. We can have our differences on the Cuban government, and we probably all agree on this call that the embargo is counterproductive policy, but just calling for the lifting of the embargo again isn't going to do it, right? Just taking a moral stance and sitting on a soapbox or standing on a soapbox and saying the embargo must come to an end. That's nice. It ain't going to cut it. The question here is, how do you create the momentum necessary to lift the embargo? Steps that the administration can be taking right now to change the dynamics between the United States and Cuba, lifting some of these sanctions through executive authority, the ones that were put in place under Trump, such as sanctions on remittances. We know that we have identified channels through which we can reestablish remittances without the military taking a cut. That is something that should be put in place already, or at least it should be moving forward to do that. Reopening travel to all the provinces, restaffing the embassy, and reestablishing the family reunification program. These are all things that would help change the narrative and help build greater momentum towards going further. At the same time, engaging the Cuban government through robust diplomatic efforts. We have an embassy. Let's put it to use. There's a lot of differences between our governments. Let's sit down on the table and let's see if we can hash out some breakthroughs, negotiate some resolutions to some of these longstanding points of contention between the governments, whether they be property claims or Cuba's role in Venezuela or what have you. I know these are very thorny issues, but if we don't sit down and talk about them and see if we can hash out a resolution, we're never going to get to it. And then based on
Rick, 2 minutes.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
2 minutes for.
So, and then all of this obviously really just, tells us the Cuban government needs to be willing to do its part. If Cuba itself is unwilling to put things on the table, it's really going to be hard for us to generate the political momentum necessary to lift the embargo. And I'm not calling for conditionality in our policy. This is not a matter of we won't do this until you do that. It's just recognizing the political reality that we live under. If we don't see changes in Cuba that help change public opinion in the United States, if we don't see changes in Cuba that help build constituencies in the United States that will push for greater changes in U.S. policy towards Cuba, it's not going to happen on its own. So the Cuban government needs to do its part. It should open up its private sector to diaspora and U.S. investment. It should stop beating up protesters in the street. It should stop doing things that animate the opposition to lifting sanctions on the United States. It should recognize its civil society. We've seen during the course of these protests over the last year that Cuba is an increasingly heterogeneous society where there's a lot of different points of opinion, a lot of different interests on the ground, and a single party system is ill-equipped to manage all that. Cuba needs to evolve, and it's not because I say it, it's because it's obvious. There's a lot of Cubans that don't feel represented by what this government is doing, and the government is not doing anything to recognize their interests or their needs or their rights. Those things, which Cubans themselves are calling for, would also go a long way to changing perceptions and creating political capital here in the United States towards going further. Last point I can make real quick, if I could just squeeze it out. Things that the Congress can do right now to help advocate, to help sort of change the dynamic, is focus on advocating on measures that will directly help the Cuban people, things that are deliverable, that can be done through executive authority, even if we don't think it can be done through Congress, and not gloss over the abuses of the Cuban government or just believe that because people are protesting on the street, this is somehow all a U.S. orchestrated act. Reality, that's not the reality on the ground. Are there some pro-democracy efforts funded through taxpayer funds? Yes, we know. But thinking that they represent all the unrest and all the discontent that you see in the streets of Cuba is completely unrealistic. That all that unrest is genuine, it's homegrown, and it's not going to go away. So we have to recognize, and I think Congress recognizing that in its statements, in its advocacy of lifting counterproductive sanctions, would help shift the narrative and help create space for this administration to move as well.
Thank you very much, Rick. Let me note for people watching in now, the CERES staff has placed in the chat box a link to a letter written 2 weeks ago by 250 entrepreneurs in Cuba, calling for changes, explaining how the sanctions hurt their own businesses. And 2 weeks ago, there was a terrific webinar that Aceri sponsored about the way in which small businesses are being impacted. And there's a link in the chat box for you to be able to look at that. We turn now to Harold Cardenas. Harold, in many ways, you've become a spokesperson for the youth in Cuba and in the United States. And you represent a growing segment of Cuban society. So can you help us understand the challenges facing initiatives like yours, like La Joven Cuba? In what way would the changes in US policy support civil society in Cuba?
Thanks, Phil. I wish I was that young. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time and the opportunity here. Yeah, I'm the director of a nonprofit organization focused on the economic, political, and social development of Cuba. We are La Joven Cuba. Our independent work is illegal to the eyes of the Cuban government. And at the same time, donations and grants are almost impossible because of OFAC sanctions. So our organization, like most Cubans in the island, is trapped between the policies that both governments have in place to satisfy the political preference of different group of hardliners. You have communists in Cuba and Cuban Americans in Florida. So we're trapped in that in between. If you let me, I will describe the last 6 months for us. We had a COVID outbreak in Cuba with some of my colleagues being sick and hospitalized, and I was unable to send them funds via Western Union or using any other platform from the US. We had the July 11th protests with the government crackdown and internet shutdown. This was a phenomenon that polarized many Cubans. We had the announced protests on November 15 this week, and the real possibility of violent extremism in Cuba. Well, why do I say this? Because since June, we are trying to create an observatory to track political radicalization in Cuba, something that is very needed. But OFAC regulations and the overall environment is making this impossible for us. Banks don't want to do business with us because we work with Cuba, with people that are located in Cuba. We are forced to hire a sanctions lawyer to navigate these issues. So we are still unable to launch the initiative while the possibilities for violent extremism grows bigger and bigger every day in Cuba. We are a civil society organization, and our most existential challenge right now is not the Cuban government, it's the US regulations. So just to give you an insight of how things are working for us. Half of my colleagues in Cuba have lost their jobs in the universities and in other institutions because they have the courage to have a public standing and write about domestic politics in Cuba, something that usually is not allowed. So some of them are unemployed since the pandemic started, and I am unable to bring them over and provide to them a stable working environment in the organization, because even when we have organizations that want to support us, US regulations makes it harder and harder every day to receive any kind of donations or funds. So that's not on the Cuban government, that's on the US government. Congress and the White House do have a moral commitment to denounce the anti-democratic behavior of other governments. Yes, that's true. But the problem is that sanctioning not only government officials, but all the common people in Cuba, that is not support for human rights. That is the opposite. So I know some of these policies are coming from the Trump years, and there are many other priorities right now in the US. But if there is enough time to make loud statements about the commitment with democracy, of course there is time to address remittances, travel, and to explore how to re-engage with Cuba. Of course there is time for that. One reason not to do this, I guess, is the long-lasting hope for regime change in Cuba. The theory that bringing the Communist Party down is going to happen with one more push. That is a theory that has lasted decades in this history, like one more push to bring the Communist Party down. This proves to be nothing more than wishful thinking at the expense of the Cuban people and Cuban civil society. So the most important event, to give you another idea, the most important event in the last few days was the November 15th rally. This was led by an anti-government activist called Junior Garcia. Well, Junior signed an open letter we published last year in Joven Cuba that was addressed to Joe Biden. This open letter was asking for the end of sanctions on Cuba. 10 days ago, Junior gave us an interview where he criticized the embargo. So when Secretary of State Antony Blinken said last Sunday that the United States stands with the people of Cuba, he's pretty much cherry picking the wishes of the Cuban people. He's saying yes to the protest, but no to the end of sanctions, even if the current opposition leader is asking for that. So I agree with Ricardo that we have a diverse civil society. You can ask entrepreneurs, independent media, and activists right now. There was no better time for civil society in Cuba than the years of normalization of relations. The spotlight was put so much in Cuban civil society that the Cuban government was prevented from having this kind of behavior. And actually the incentives for dialogue existed there. Today, what we have is more government repression, more people in jails, more limits from the US government to operate in Cuba. Thank you so much. The recent announcements that the Biden administration has done have zero effect on Cuba. And they are actually keeping in place the policies of the previous administration. This kind of behavior was expected from the Trump administration that was always pandering to the Cuban Americans in Florida and cultivating hate instead of the bridges of diplomacy. But this is actually unbecoming for the Biden administration. If I can, I will share a personal story. I supported Joe Biden when he's run for president. I posted in social media, I supported him publicly. I call people on the phone banks. I knock on houses in Pennsylvania. So Cuban American YouTubers in Florida called me communist for not supporting Trump then. And I was receiving hate messages. My wife received threats. It was horrible during those years because I was supporting Joe Biden. With the current policy with Cuba right now, I think, and actually I think it's reality, those Cuban Americans that harassed me now have better odds to be heard by the Biden administration than moderate people like me. So I think that's crazy. But back to the civil society topic, I think Cuban society needs to operate in a more relaxed environment to grow and to connect with each other. And in our case, in case of how in Cuba, do the hard work of cultivating democratic values in Cuban society. That is very hard in such a polarized and radicalized society. So the current policy that we have right now is electroshocking the Cuban people and wishing that they accommodate to the expectations. Instead, we believe that it's better to bet on education, information, engagement. One policy is very easy, and the other one is the right thing to do, in our opinion. We are asking the Biden administration to return to a path of engagement and advance democratic goals by example and not by suffocating the whole nation in their pursuit of their political goals. What we are asking right now is the moral courage of not being Trump. And I think that's not a big ask. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It was very, very informative. Let me remind the audience that you can ask questions in the Q&A. We're looking forward to getting questions, particularly from congressional staffers. Our last speaker is Carlos Alzugurai. You've probably seen him on TV. He frequently is quoted in the New York Times and Washington Post. Let me ask you, Carlos, how you would respond to Rick Herrera's commentary that there needs to be changes in Cuba in order for things to be take a normal stand. How do Cuban officials see U.S. policy?
Okay, can I start speaking now? Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay, I brought a PowerPoint presentation which I wish that was put up after I finished my introduction. Well, they put it. Okay. Thank you first for allowing me. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone. And well, I will start with the answer to that question. The problem is that sometimes from outside Cuba, the hype and the propaganda is such that they don't see what is really happening. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the National Assembly approved 4 new laws that modernize the Cuban justice system. Among them, a law on due process. So all these guarantees that we are trying to push, people like me are trying to push, and I recognize the problem. Okay, I don't reject the idea that the Cuban government behaves authoritarian way in many ways and justifies itself with the aggressive policy of the United States, which is a fact. It exists. It's not something that is invented. But sometimes those things are not looked at, and the narrative is like what Rick said. He said, "Well, the Cuban government shut down the Brothers to the Rescue plane." Come on, these guys were violating Cuban airspace, and they have been provoking. True, the Cuban government should have been more smarter than not like to be provoked. But I must tell Rick, in 1959, when incidents like this were happening, President Eisenhower, in a meeting of the National Security Council, said, "Why doesn't Cuba shoot down those planes?" So this is something that should be taken in a more nuanced way. And I think the Cuban government has responded, but the Cuban government is also responding to the Cuban people. We have demands, and one of the problems that people like me, the other day, the New York Times classified me as a critical supporter of the government, but they put critical on quotes, like I am not sufficiently critical. Believe you me, I am critical. I was classified recently by a government official media as the renegade diplomats. So it is. So please now, can you put in the slide, Leonardo, please? Okay, I will go very fast through these slides. I want to leave these slides with the organizer so that if someone wants to look at some of my arguments in the slide presentation, I would welcome it. Please, first slide, the full slide. Leonardo, please, the full slide. Okay, here is my full slide. Yes, there is a crisis in Cuba. Yes, among the causes of the crisis is the incapacity to deal with change and diversity by the Cuban government. It's true. It's true that the mistakes and the blunders in the economic reform have created this crisis. And no doubt that the government has lost credibility and political capital. I have written about that on many of my articles on this issue. But let me say a couple of things that are important, I think, from the point of view of policy of the United States. First, the myth. The Cuban government has no path out of the crisis. Yes, there is a path out of the crisis, and as a matter of fact, the Cuban government is implementing it. Among them, the stimulation to the private sector. For example, I am participating next week in a private sector assembly, and yesterday I was at two private businesses. My barbershop. By the way, many Americans who come to Cuba use that barbershop. He's pushing. The guy really has expanded. I was surprised that he has expanded his barbershop. Now it's a 2-floor business. And the other one was a new restaurant. Phil knows the area around 21 and L in Vedado. We had lunch several years ago at one of these places. Well, there are 5 or 6 new places there. So obviously the government is moving, and I mean it got out of the pandemic, which is also something that has to be understood. The government dealt with the pandemic, and apparently we are coming out of the pandemic. Not many countries in the world can say that, and with our own vaccines, something very important. Another myth that is usually spoken of is that the Cuban government is a monolith. It's monolithic. No way. The Cuban government is made of people, and people sometimes have different opinions. There is a wing in the Cuban government that is reformist, and there is a wing that is hardline. Now, one of the problems we have is that the US policy helps the hardliners. It doesn't help the reformists. The Cuban leadership has lost all support. Not true. One of the interesting things that happened with this call to demonstrations, I heard predictions, millions will come out of the streets and they will overthrow the government. The government is about to fall. Well, actually, that's not what happened. And let me tell you 3 things that didn't happen, which were predicted. Mass arrest. I think my latest information is that they were not more than 50 people arrested. And these 50 people who were who went out to demonstrate, because most of the people stayed at home. True, many of the people stayed at home because of government intimidation. But let me tell you another thing. There were pictures of people with sticks. Not a single person was hit by a stick during this the 15 November, different from the 11 July, what happened in 11 July. Another prediction, the government would cut off internet. No, internet. So you can see that there is movement, that there is change. Let me go to the next slide. My next slide is just, and I'll leave it there, is some analysis I have made of theoretical discussions about economic sanctions, regime change. I start with a very interesting article by Peter Baynard in the New York Times in February this year, where he called this kind of policies economic wars. Economic wars and making cities under siege. Now, I'm going to repeat something that San Ignacio de Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, said, that in a besieged fortress, dissent is treason. Well, yes, there are people who think that way in Cuba, and they might be right in the sense that Cuba has an enormous enemy, the United States, and the United States right now, it is embarked in a regime change policy. A regime change policy that, as Downs and Monten argumented in an international security paper back in 2013, it's not true that this events, when they are successful, bring about democracy. Sometimes the countries where the United States succeeds in regime change, they turn out to be much worse than what they were. Now, the important thing here is that it's not going to happen. Regime change is not going to happen. And if you look at the batch of the group of color revolutions that were stimulated from the outside against Lukashenko in Belarus, against Assad in Syria, against Ortega in Nicaragua, against Maduro in Venezuela, they didn't work. So the idea that this is going to work is quite impossible. Now, the next slide. In my next slide, what I try to do is underline what are the impacts that the system has in Cuban society. Well, in part, that's what Ricardo Torres and Harold mentioned. It is terrible what is happening, because the policy of the United States is perverse. On the one hand, economic pressure to bring about social instability, and then on the other hand, political subvention programs, that the one that Junior Garcia Aguilera attended in Madrid, in Buenos Aires, in Madrid. I mean, I know Laura Tedesco and Ruth Diabain, the two Argentinian academics who organized these seminars. These were subversion seminars. They didn't have anything to do with real academic work. As a matter of fact, the most important experts on Cuban armed forces were not consulted, like Hal Klepak, or like, I forgot his name, this guy at Florida International University, Frank Mora. They were not consulted, the experts. So this was really a very clear example of subversive political activities financed by the United States, which end up very bad. I mean, this has ended up with influencing this young man that probably would have a great impact in Cuba, and now he is in exile. And of course, I mean, it's probable that he will not coming back. Now,
Carlos, 2 moments.
Do I agree with I agree? Yeah, okay. Do I agree with the way that he was treated? Of course not. But what the U.S. policy does is stimulate the polarization in the Cuban political environment by, on the one hand, stimulating the idea of regime change, overthrow of the government on the opposition. Now, a very much Trumpian opposition, because Archipelago is full of Trumpist people in Miami, which made push Archipelago in a hard line and made the government react the way that it regarded. And at the same time, it facilitates the job of the hardliners. Let me go to the final slide. My final slide points out to the anomalies that exist in the Cuban-U.S. relationship right now, and the way that they should be fixed. First anomaly: diplomatic relations, but no consular section managing visas. Anomaly number 2, please, Leonardo. Anomaly number 2: diplomatic relations, but no meaningful exchanges between the two governments of issues of mutual interest. Why do you have diplomatic relations anyway if you don't have a dialogue with the Cuban government? Leonardo, again, the next anomaly. Anomaly number 3. Cuba undergoing a critical juncture and changes happening, and yet the United States has practically closed down the embassy, which means that they depend on the diaspora. I here remember Fred Halliday in 2007 wrote an article after the Iraq debacle, pointing out how wrong it is to pay attention to the diaspora without paying attention to what's happening on the ground. So it's interesting because I used to talk with American diplomats very often when we had a normal situation. Now I have no contact with the American diplomats. I could give them a different idea of what's happening in Cuba. Anomaly number 4, no cultural, scientific, educational exchanges, practically totally disrupted. Anomaly number 5. Ronald, yes, the US has diplomatic relations with states that sponsor terrorism. Really? Can you have diplomatic relations with a state that sponsors terrorism? That's another anomaly. Next, Leonardo. Anomaly number 6. I cannot read it from here. Remittances. Well, Harold pointed out the situation. I mean, the US allows remittances with countries that it has sanctions. By the way, I am a defender of the idea that Cuba has to stop depending on remittances. If this situation has demonstrated something, is how negative can it be for Cuba to depend on remittances? We have to avoid that, but people need it. So people need it. Final anomaly, Leonardo, please. The final anomaly is travel. Travel by Cuban Americans and Americans is practically stopped. Now, of course, the pandemic was partly responsible, but Mr. Trump had already practically stopped. This isolates Cuba, isolates the American public from what is really happening in Cuba, and that can only lead to misunderstandings between the two countries. I am finished. Phil, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So let me turn to questions, but let me point out in relationship to what Carlos has told us, there were 22 memoranda of understanding between Cuba and the United States. Those still exist. President Trump did not remove those. He did impose some new sanctions, but those 22 memoranda of understanding are in the US national interest. And as such, they should be implemented. Trump didn't do that, but President Obama could, but he has to have engagement in order to do that. And those would serve US interests. So let me turn now to questions that you asked.
Phil, may I say something there? Just one thing. The interesting thing about those memorandums is that Cuba complied with all of them. Nobody can say, and I address here what Rick said, nobody can say that Cuba didn't comply with the 22 memorandums.
Thank you, Carlos. So first question, and let me ask Harold to take this question. There are many Cuban American voices that say that there should be fewer sanctions on Cuba, but they seem not, and the questioner says these are in the majority of Cuban Americans, and yet they're not listened to. What prevents the US administration from paying attention to this community? What factors or influences or interests are obstructing that?
Yeah, thanks. I think that it's easy to underestimate the influence of the White House on Cuban Americans. What we saw with Obama was that there was a portion of Cuban Americans that when the White House changed the policy and they saw the incentives of normalization and that they were able to do many stuff with their families, with Cuba, and to reconnect and all that, they really supported that. And when Trump said that, said differently, and when Trump said that you will have change in Cuba and everything will be better through the other way, they moved with Trump because they accommodate to the White House when the White House gives them hope for the future. I think hope is a word here. So if the only hope right now is regime change as presented by the White House, that's what they're going to follow, many of these Cuban Americans. That's on one side. I think that there is an agency on the White House on actually accommodating the support of the Cuban Americans to the policy towards Cuba, because many accommodate to the White House. The other thing is, I'm always reluctant to take, I know we have a huge portion of our people in Florida, but I've always been reluctant to take democratic tips from Florida. Florida doesn't have the best track on democracy, we know. And for some reason, the only reason that we're listening to Florida Cuban Americans is because there are a lot of them there. So I think we also have to see, what do they want? Is what they want is democracy, or they want a far-right government in Cuba? Like, I don't see the benefit of taking out a far-right left-wing government, you know, taking out a Stalin-style democracy in Cuba and replacing that with a Bolsonaro in the Caribbean and put it in Cuba. Like, why are those the choices that we have to choose from? I think that there's more nuance there that we have to, and the White House and the Congress should definitely be careful of not supporting radical actors, because that's not democracy promotion. That is radicalizing the country. And it is very dangerous to have a radicalized Cuba 90 miles away from the United States. I don't know why that is not being addressed more often.
Ricardo Herrera is still with us. Just a second. Ricardo Herrera, can you speak to this?
Yeah, I'm still here, actually. So I would like to chime in on this. Look, I do think public opinion has taken a hit insofar as travel, remittances, and other of these measures are concerned, in part because any action that is seen as a concession to the Cuban government, particularly when we are seeing rising repression on the island, and repression against activists is basically dominating all the headlines. You see public opinion shift. Now, also, aside from that, however, the narrative in the community hasn't really changed since the Trump years. The Trump administration made a very concerted and consistent effort to change the narrative towards Cuba within the Cuban American community. Trump had a steady presence in South Florida. If he wasn't visiting Miami, one of his lieutenants were. You either had Pompeo or Bolton or other senior members of the White House visiting Miami on a regular basis. He was showing real leadership, and he was selling the policy to the community and helping to shift opinion on policy within the community. Biden has been urged not to do anything that would be considered unpopular towards Cuba that could hurt the Democrats. I would argue that he is right now doing the most unpopular thing that you could possibly do towards Cuba, which is neglecting his duty to lead. Cuban Americans may differ on elements of U.S.-Cuba policy, but they all agree on one thing. They don't like to be ignored. They don't like a president that doesn't pay attention to them at all. And right now, that is the impression that they're getting. I am certain that if this administration, if this president were to show up in Miami, deliver a speech in solidarity with the Cuban people, announce changes in policy that are focused on empowering the Cuban people, on making it easier for people on the ground to get ahead, through travel, remittances, support for the expanding private sector, support for civil society, etc. That would be well received, and it would help change the narrative, and you would see that reflected in changes in public opinion.
Can I ask, one of the important things that happened during the Clinton administration, Carlos Alzugurai points to Helms-Burton, but President Clinton changed the narrative from saying we have to respond to what Cuba does reciprocally to saying we have to act in terms of U.S. national interests. That was the narrative that President Obama followed. Why has President Biden returned to the reciprocal notion that we won't do anything unless Cuba does something we want? Can anyone explain that? No?
I don't think Biden has returned to necessarily a reciprocal notion. There has been no articulation of a policy towards Cuba that has emerged from this White House. They've made it clear time and again, Cuba's not a priority. Statements that have been delivered since July 11th, which they admit caught them flat-footed, have been clearly reacting to pressures and calling out the abuses of the regime. But there has been no articulation of what their policy or even what their policy posture should be towards Cuba. We're still waiting on that.
Fair answer. Carlos, can you give us a sense of the sense of threat? Is that a real perception on the part of Cuban officials? And does that contribute to the repression that we hear about?
Turn on the mic. Phil, my view is a mixed thing. Yeah, obviously a part of the government and the repressive forces use it as an excuse. And for example, many people in Cuba are complaining that they didn't actually show any evidence that Junior Garcia Aguilera was acting because he was controlled by the CIA, by the US. People say, no, I have a personal opinion. I think he was influenced by a certain, I entered Archipelago. I am a member of Archipelago. And I have had discussions in Archipelago time and again. But it was obvious from the beginning, even though Junior tried to create the image that Archipelago was a diverse platform, that was not the case. The narrative and the discussion in Archipelago was constantly calling for the violent overthrow of the Cuban government. They were saying it. There were people saying it. And if you try to argue something, they practically did something I call a digital meeting de repudio. They would attack you brutally in order for you not to say, listen, there is another way to do this. So obvious that if things had happened the way that they had prognosticated, and the government had acted the way that it was prognosticated. I want to emphasize this. It's obvious that even though the government tried to stop the demonstration from happening, they didn't act in such a non-restrained way as on July 11th. Maybe one can explain the reaction of the government forces on July 11th because they were taken aback. They were surprised. They didn't expect it. But this time, again, I am going to emphasize, I remember watching a video of a guy who actually demonstrated. This guy actually went on the street, said a lot of things, and the policeman didn't even touch him. They said very courteously, okay, you have said your piece. Now you get into the patrol car because we're going to take you somewhere else. And I insist, you have to speak about these things in a nuanced way, because, for example, Junior yesterday said in his press conference in Madrid that the Cuban dictatorship was like the Pinochet dictatorship. Come on, my God, this is presenting Cuba as something that it is not. I am not condoning the repression. I am not condoning it. And as a matter of fact, I have been critical of the repression in several ways. I even have signed letters to the president on this. But the situation in Cuba is completely different. I gave one of the American media an interview the other day. I emphasized that many people didn't come out of the streets because they simply didn't want to come out of the streets. And she immediately said, but there was a heavy-handed attitude by the police. And I said, yes, of course. Well, what did appear in the report? Only what I said about the heavy-handed. The other part where I said that people had not gone out on the street because they didn't feel that it was necessary to do it, that didn't appear in the report.
Thank you. Let me ask Ricardo Torres. Ricardo, can you give us a sense of what's very specific things that President Biden could do if he wanted to ameliorate some of the problems in Cuba?
Well, Phil, well, I think Rick Herrero and Harold as well, they've talked about that. Reality is that we Cubans, we also need to understand that there is something called U.S. politics and U.S. domestic politics. And I agree with Rick Herrero that we need to understand the dynamics of that if we ever want to produce meaningful change when it comes to Cuba policy. That's something that we have to understand that. But right now, I mean, my guiding light would be what could help the Cuban people, not the Cuban government, but the Cuban people. And then, it leads me to something is one of the, conundrums, I think, of U.S. policy currently, which is doing something for the Cuban people in a way bypassing the Cuban government. I think that's one, it's something that is very difficult to disentangle. I look forward to see how they are going to do that, because one thing is that we say whether we like the Cuban government or not, and well, many reasons in Cuba and outside Cuba not to like the Cuban government, but the other thing is the Cuban government is in charge of Cuba, whether we like it or not. It's in charge of Cuba. So doing something for the Cuban people that completely bypasses the Cuban government or ignores the fact that the Cuban government is in charge is very unrealistic. Well, maybe two things could help a lot. And I think this is, these are things that the president could do even without the Congress, which is one, restoring a legal channel to send remittances so that relative, Cuban Americans in the United States can send money to their family in Cuba. This is especially a hard time. Cuba is now only emerging from the pandemic. And the other thing could be, eliminating all the restrictions for, travel to Cuba, meaning, letting U.S. airlines to fly to all the airports, the provinces in Cuba, and also, in a way, restoring the capacity of Americans to travel to Cuba legally, even though we know that tourism is prohibited by law. Those two things could be very important. For the Cuban people, especially, although we know that not everyone is going to benefit the same way. And the other thing, but also they could help the emerging private sector. One last thing could be facilitating Cuba's food inputs. That's something that could produce also some benefit for the Cuban people. Cuba can import from the United States food right now, but it cannot, under some restrictions, important restrictions. Facilitating that trade could also be, in my opinion, very important right now. That the country is in the midst of its deepest economic crisis in 3 decades.
Thank you, Ricardo. That's very helpful. Harold Cardenas, you have a final comment you want to make about this?
Yeah, thank you. I think that regarding Cuba, to some extent, the Biden administration feels intimidated by the Cuban Americans. And the fact is that the Republican Party has a monopoly on the narrative in Florida, like Ricardo was saying before, and the Democrats are actually not fighting back. to trying to reclaim, their own narrative in Florida, like Obama actually did, and it was very effective during Obama. They're not fighting back. They're trying to accommodate to what Trump did, and accommodating to what Trump does doesn't sound like a very good policy. So we have to break that machine of radicalization of Cubans that is happening in Florida. Like in my experience, many Cubans come from Cuba. Many Cubans come from the island. They have very little knowledge on democratic values. They have or political participation, and they arrive to this bubble in Florida that is super radicalized, that is super conservative, and that the Democrats are doing nothing to bring them over. Only the Republicans are pretty much having this machine of radicalization, and then they think that freedom and democracy is this short view of being, Republican, conservative, that is being a democratic person. So we have to fight back on that, I think. And the Biden administration is doing nothing on that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Harold. Let me sum up then. What we've seen is that a change in U.S. policy towards Cuba would not be a gift to the government, that it would be consistent with U.S. humanitarian goals of actually helping the Cuban people, and would likely reduce human rights violations, which is also a goal of the US government. And politically, it would even be popular with Cuban Americans who want to send money to their relatives and to enable family members to obtain visas so that they can visit the United States. You can be involved in this as well, as the staff is putting up on the screen the Dear Colleague letter. Let me note to you that the deadline for signing that letter is December 3rd, and you can ask your representative to add his or her name to that Dear Colleague letter. There's also legislation that your representative might want to know about that would facilitate US-Cuban trade. However unlikely it would be to pass in the Senate, it still is something to consider. There's S-249, S-1694, and HR 3625. The links to that are also in the chat, as well as the webinar on that Sarce produced 2 weeks ago. Thank you very much for staying with us, and I hope this was informative for you. Good afternoon.